Hello and welcome. This is Lunchtime Politics on Channels Television and we're reaching you live. I am Bukola Koka. Our main stories. Federal government approves 5 billion naira each for states to procure grains and fertilizers as part of efforts to cushion the effects of subsidy removal. NLC-TUC knock federal government's 5 billion naira palliative fund as they say implementation process cannot be trusted. Plus, Niger state government targets 7.5 billion naira monthly internally generated revenue from harmonized collections from 1st of January 2024. Thank you again for staying tuned. And as we start off, the federal government has approved the sum of 5 billion naira each for state governors for the procurement of grains and fertilizers as part of efforts to cushion the effects of subsidy removal. This is part of the resolutions reached at the National Economic Council meeting held at the Presidential Villa, Abuja. Our State House correspondent, Emperor Simon, reports.
It's the third National Economic Council meeting since the commencement of the present administration, and governors from across the Federation and other stakeholders are in attendance. The Vice President, Senator Kashim Shettima, is chairing the meeting held at the Council Chamber of the Presidential Villa. The meeting goes into a closed door after the national anthem. Few hours later, Governors Yaya Bello of Kogi State, Shey Makinde of Oyo State, Babagana Zulum of Borno State, Charles Soludo of Anambra State, and Ubasani of Kaduna State briefed journalists on some of the resolutions reached, beginning with the preliminary report on the 2022 flood disaster, which claimed over 600 lives.
Only 16 out of the total number of affected states forwarded their submission to NEC Secretariat to date, as expected. About 15 others were yet to do so. There is therefore the need to expedite the release of funds to affected states as recommended by the designated committee constituted by the federal government to that effect. This will go a long way in addressing the needs of the victims as well as offset debts incurred by some states to some citizens.
Some vital resolutions were also reached by the Council to address the difficulties faced by Nigerians in the aftermath of subsidy removal.
The federal government of Nigeria has released 5 trucks of rice to each state last week. Furthermore, in order to cushion the effect of food shortages across the country, the federal government has approved the sum of 5 billion naira to be given to each state for the procurement of 100,000 bags of rice, 40,000 bags of maize, and fertilizers. 52% of this money is given to states as grants, while 48% of the 5 billion naira is to be paid back on an installment basis within a period of 2 years, 20 months to the CBN by the states and the local government areas in Nigeria.
Clarification here is again, 5 billion was actually approved, but until this moment, only 2 billion have been given to the states.
A committee was also set up to interface with organized labor over the fuel subsidy removal. The committee is chaired by the governor of Anambra State, Professor Charles Soludo. The National Economic Council also noted with concern the impact of the crisis in Niger, especially on food security in frontline states.
and directed that the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, expedite action on the distribution of food to those who are mostly affected. From the Presidential Villa, Abuja, Empress Simon, Channels Television News.
And we'll return to the Palliative Intervention Fund much later. But in the meantime, the government is not unmindful of the challenges being faced by Nigerians as a result of its economic policies. And this is coming from the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Mr. George Akume. Mr. Akume, who was speaking on behalf of the President at a book launch in Abuja, however, appealed to Nigerians to bear the pains of the reforms because it's in the interest of the country to take such tough decisions in order to remove all bottlenecks hampering the growth of the economy. He was speaking on behalf of the President. The book launch in honor of elder statesman Chief Edwin Clark attracted a large turnout of dignitaries. Our correspondent Dele Omoyeni tells us more.
We are going through a difficult phase in the history of this country. But these pains are pains of birth of a new nation. And that if you want to celebrate a child, a baby, then the mother must go through some pains. But at the end of the day, there is joy, there is merriment when the baby arrives. And we will certainly be there. Solutions to problems can never be as instant as coffee, but we must certainly be there. I know the removal of fuel subsidy has created some pains, and that is why palliatives are being put in place. 100 trucks, fertilizers have been sent to the states, 100 trucks of grains have been sent, and more are coming, and more buses are also coming. We can endure this for a moment. But what we're going through today is for a better tomorrow.
And for more on the Palliative Intervention Fund, as announced by the National Economic Council yesterday, I have joining me on Lunchtime Politics, Mr. Kalu Aja. He's an economist who joins us virtually from the US. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Kalu Aja.
Like this?
The audio through to Mr. Aja seems not to be fully sorted out. We'll return to him. In the meantime, the planned arraignment of the suspended Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Mr. Godwin Emefiele, at the Federal Capital Territory High Court in Abuja was stalled on Thursday. Although Mr. Emefiele, who is the first defendant, was in court, the second defendant, Sadatu Yaro, was absent, prompting the arraignment to be adjourned to August the 23rd, 2023. Counsel to the federal government and Director of Public Prosecution of the Federation, Mr. Mohammed Abubakar, informed the court that Mrs. Sadatu Yaro took ill earlier on Thursday and was unable to make it to court. Justice Muazu subsequently fixed the 23rd of August for the arraignment.
It was a calm atmosphere at the FCT High Court in Maitama, Abuja, as personnel of the Department of State Services positioned themselves ahead of the planned arraignment of the suspended Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Mr. Godwin Emefiele. As journalists waited outside the courtroom to capture the arrival of Mr. Emefiele, he walks briskly into the court from one of the adjoining offices around the court, but the arraignment was, however, stalled owing to the absence of the second defendant, Sadatu Yaro. Counsel to the federal government, Mr. Mohammed Abubakar, while applying for a new date for the arraignment, informed the court that Mrs. Yaro took ill in the morning and is unable to make it to the court. The application for adjournment was not opposed by Mr. Emefiele's counsel, Akinlulu Kehinde, SAN. After the adjournment, lawyers and security agents shield Mr. Emefiele from the prying cameras of journalists in court.
You go for press conference.
Let's go and drink outside.
Probably to further ensure the TV cameras are unable to capture Mr. Emefiele, the lights in the courtroom suddenly go off. Outside the courtroom, counsel to Mr. Emefiele berates the federal government for stalling the arraignment.
The matter was meant for arraignment this morning, but two things played out, which clearly showed that the complainant itself was not ready for the arraignment. The second defendant was not made available. The second defendant was not in court. And it is right that all the defendants in a charge must be present to take their plea. And consequently, the complainant on its own requested for an adjournment for the arraignment to be done at a later date.
Lawyers in defense of democracy and human rights on their part decry the planned arraignment of Mr. Emefiele.
The DSS was formed to look at internal security, to handle matters that borders on internal security, terrorism. We expected that the charges will reflect terrorism count charges. Unfortunately, or surprisingly, what we saw was matters bordering on procurement, that he gave contract for the award of land cruisers. Gentlemen, this is a charade.
The suspended governor of the central bank will be arraigned alongside Saadatu Yaro and her company April 1616 Investment Limited on a 20-count charge of procurement fraud, conspiracy, and conferring corrupt advantages on his associates to the tune of 6.9 billion naira.
And yet again, we return to our big story, which somehow happens to be, on the front burner of all discussions at this time. And I have joining me now Mr. Kalu Aja, who is an economist. He joins us from the United States of America. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Aja.
How are you doing? Good morning.
I take it you can hear me. If you can, what are the quick macroeconomic gains, particularly that the country can glean from this 5 billion naira palliative intervention fund?
Well, one word is that it's a bit too little and a bit too late. 5 billion is about how much the state gets in FARC in a month. So unless we're saying that the total palliative is going to be just what one state gets in a month, and that might not be sufficient in my view. Also, it's too uniform. Lagos State with large population gets as much as, say, Bayelsa with a small population. So not really a means-tested way to distribute palliatives, in my view. A bit too little, a bit too late. It's good response to the cries, but I would prefer something a bit more, targeted and well thought out. Larger population states should get more money, and again, we should basically increase how much they're getting. 1 month is a bit too small just to give us a palliative for 300% increase in fuel prices. Yeah.
And that forms, some of the sentiments that, are trickling down, to the social media space, particularly. Some Northerners are saying that it's, not unfair, that's the word, that some states, smaller in size relatively, are getting the same amount as those with higher population. But perhaps we can take a look at other aspects of the discussion, which is the huge distrust in the administration of the palliative intervention fund. Many have expressed doubts that the governors can administer this effectively. What template or database, that's the language now, would you recommend such that this palliative fund can get to the vulnerable, those who need it, rather than into the wrong pockets?
Well, if I had to do it myself, I would go with mobile phones. So mobile phones on the cell centers, they are in that particular state, right? So if you do mobile phones that are NIN enabled, then you have something to go off with, right? Then you, of course, do BVN or NIN, and you do e-Naira. So you're not giving out cash, you're going to send digital Naira to NIN-enabled phones that are in the state. So because the cell tower ping, you can know they're in this particular state, and you can only send funds to a particular phone attached to a particular person with the biometric, i.e. NIN. That means it's a much better, should we say, register than what any state would have, because it's verifiable. You can go back and say who owns this phone. With the NIN, you have a biometric, so you eliminate the duplication. Because I think Nigerians are not too comfortable with the last humanitarian ministry that shared out billions, and we really didn't see a lot happen. So a lot of mistrust around if the government can share out palliatives, and using technology will sort of enable there to be less, more acceptability. And of course, it can be tracked and it can be done tomorrow. NIN is available. The phones are available. Just ask folks to go register if you don't have a register already, and then use e-Naira and send the funds out to the folks' phones, and they can have those phones and then go to their bank and convert the e-Naira to actual Naira cash. That's how I would do it if I had to do it.
But there are Nigerians, who are not captured necessarily under structures of government, like agencies, like local government levels, Nigerians who are in the informal sector. How can they, be part of the program such that they will not be left out?
Yeah, that's the worry, because the register that they have right now doesn't capture everybody. I'm from a tiny town in Abia State. I don't think anyone in my village is captured on that register. But almost everyone has a cell phone, and the e-Naira does work with the SSS code, the SMS code. So I think it's a much, much better proposition to tell people, again, technology, to go and use a phone. We did fertilizer to farmers using phones. So it's a nice leap to go from there to sharing palliative funds, either the rice or the Naira cash, to individual households, right, using technology. Because any other way, there's no other Naira, no database out there that we can say with 100% certainty that we can audit and be comfortable with if it's going to be used to share out 5 billion. So again, it has to go back to tech. NIN-enabled phones, paying to cell towers to let you know you are in that particular state. Don't share out cash, share out e-Naira, then you can go to your bank account and convert your e-Naira to cash. So lots of stages that we can do the audit. We can audit through the cell towers, we can audit through the NIN phones, we can audit when you convert your e-Naira to physical Naira at the banks. This way, people are more, they see that it's a bit more, should we say, credible, and then you get a lot more buy-in. If you want the funds, go get a phone. And you don't have to have a smartphone, right? The SMS phones, they can work with it. So that's the way to go.
Now let's look at the forex market, Mr. Aja, which is pretty much, the bane of, the consequences that Nigeria is witnessing, i.e. the policy of subsidy removal and the need for this intervention in the first place. The CBN has, come up with some measures of the floating of the Naira, clamping down on speculators, but it's as if the gains are not coming in. The results that would show that these interventions are working are not coming in. Does it reflect that the economic managers themselves have an understanding of the situation, or they're just as helpless as the market?
Not really. I think the CBN floated. They took the peg off the dollar, which meant that the dollar rate is now willing buyer, willing seller. If I want to send dollars, I can sell. But I think the mistake they made with the initial was to leave the 44 items still as banned, which then meant that the new quote-unquote importers-exporters window was still the CBN methodology. You couldn't say import those 44 items. So what did the importers do? They simply went to the black market, went back to the black market. So you then saw that disparity between the black market and the earning window start to widen. That's what had happened over time. And of course, supply has gone to where it's going to get a higher return. So supply simply went to the black market and not to the iron window. Does that arbitrage then open? So what they've done now, they've signed this new 3 billion thing with the NNPC, the 3 billion loan. That should bring some temporary relief to the market. But we haven't addressed the real issues. The rates can only go down and be stable if supply is stable. And supply is really based on crude oil exports. If you look at these news stories we're hearing about crude oil export, is down or flat. That's the main issue I've got to address. That long-term supply is shaky. If you address supply and you focus on the diaspora, that settles the supply, the remittances, that settles supply. Then these 3 billion things are now additives that can add confidence and take away the speculation. But for now, it's more like the last, or within the last regime, but just with a new name, willing buyer, willing seller, but still 44 items are banned. So if it's going to be floated, then we can afford what we can afford or cannot afford what we can't afford. But this back and forth lack of policy is what is, I think, killing the new market.
And lastly, Mr. Aja, if we look at what's been said, particularly in the last few weeks following the removal of subsidy, governors have said that they have increased amounts accruing to them from the Federation account following the removal of subsidy. And the economy, when we talk about the economy of the country, it's not just in Lagos or in Abuja. We're talking about the economy across the states of the Federation. What can they do in the long term that would stabilize the economy beyond the temporary palliative intervention fund at the state level?
Great question. So, I mean, the problem in Nigeria today is the fall in household consumption. 2022, Nigerian Bureau of Statistics said consumption in Nigeria was 0. That's 2022, before we increased the fuel prices, before we depegged the naira. So no consumption. You are seeing that show up in the fast-moving consumer goods stocks are flat. Those guys are all making the losses. No one is buying food, right, or buying items because they have no money. Now we've increased the cost to the household. So what needs to happen is to go back and reflate consumer spending by taking away cost from the household. Number one, you've got to increase their revenues by income, by raising the minimum wage. But number two, the costs have got to come down for the Nigerian household so they can afford to buy food. Food is the number one expense of an average Nigerian household. 68% spent by the average Nigerian household to buy food. Food is also 51% of the consumer price index. So anything you do to address food, you're giving Nigerians a pay hike. So what I would focus on is to use this palliative, right? Instead of giving away 5 billion, I would take the whole 150 billion, i.e. 5 multiplied by 30 or so states, and just do a 3-month import subsidy on food. Let food come in, crash the price immediately for a very, very short temporary time. Once food is cheap, inflation can go down, the cost to the households can go down. This buys you time to then do your longer term agricultural initiatives for fertilizer and land to get outputs up, and also take away the insecurity of the farmlands. So anything we do without addressing high food costs is going to be temporary. We're back here in 6 months and everything's going to be a high inflation. 26% food inflation is unsustainable for any family. So target food, use those funds and target food, either it's imports or reducing the cost of foods at the market. That's what we need to do.
Interesting. And, when you talk about food, there's also the release of 100,000 trucks of grains. But that's another part of the conversation. And we're totally out of time. But we look forward to having you again to benefit from your wealth of experience. We thank you very much, Mr. Kalu Aja. Mr. Kalu Aja is an economist who joined us from the United States of America. Thank you very much. More stories now. The Niger state government has set a target of hitting 7.5 billion naira monthly internally generated revenue from harmonized collections beginning from the 1st of January 2024. Speaking during a 2-day retreat on revenue harmonization in Niger State, organized by the State Internal Revenue Service, the governor, represented by the Secretary to the State Government, Abubakar Usman, explains that the State Revenue Service's expectations beginning from September this year expect that a monthly return of 4.5 billion naira from the harmonized collections. Mr. Bago charged participants to explore all necessary avenues of boosting government revenue streams, starting with the harmonization of collection by the ministries, departments and agencies, and the 25 local government councils as provided by the State Tax Administration and Consolidation Law 2022. And ahead of the November governorship election in Imo State, the National Orientation Agency has tasked relevant stakeholders to promote peace and support the agency's mission to mobilize the electorate and ensure credible, free, fair and violent-free election. The Director General of the NOA, Mr. Garba Abari, gave this charge in Owerri, the Imo State capital, while flagging off the agency's off-season governorship poll sensitization campaign on understanding the new Electoral Act, civic participation and peace. According to the Director General, who was represented by one of his directors, Emefiele, he said the stakeholders meeting is centered on solving the issues of low turnout of voters, poor understanding of the 2022 Electoral Act by the electorate, incidents of electoral violence, and low level of inclusion of vulnerable persons in the electoral process.
So thank you so much. Much regards to the significance. Imo State is one of the 8 states where governorship elections were not held during the last general election. We are concerned about the relatively poor turnout of voters despite the seeming enthusiasm shown by Nigerians towards the 2023 general elections. Though INEC has not formally released its analysis of voter turnout in the elections, however, going by the analysis of some stakeholders during the election, we achieved less than 30% of registered voters who came out to exercise their civic duty or election day. Out of the total of 93.47 million registered voters, only 24.9 million persons actually voted in the presidential and national assembly elections. This represents a meager 26.72% voter turnout. Actually, the lowest percentage since the return to democracy in 1999. There is an obvious need to deepen the understanding of the 2022 Electoral Act, which, by various accounts, has significantly altered the experience of our people at the polling stations. Some of the provisions of the new law attempt to take care of the violent nature of voting and misbehaviors on the voting day.
And you have been served this edition of Lunchtime Politics for today and the entire week. We thank you for being there and urge you to join us again, same time next week. I am Bukola Koka. Bye for now.